The ship moved slowly through space. It was not a fast ship by any measure, but it was steady and strong, and the people inside it had come a long way. The vessel was called the Resolute, and it carried 12 human beings through the cold black between the stars toward a place most of them had never seen before. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the front window and looked out at the darkness. She had been on many ships before this one. She had sat in many rooms and spoken to many people and shaken many hands. But this was different. This was the Galactic Assembly. This was the place where the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the known universe came to make decisions about everything. Humanity had been a member of the Assembly for 40 years. 40 years sounded like a long time, but in a place where some civilizations had been members for 10,000 years, 40 years was nothing at all. The humans were new. They were young. They were, in the eyes of most of the elder races, barely worth paying attention to. Elena knew this. She had known it for a long time. It did not bother her the way it used to. She had learned to be patient. Behind her, her team was getting ready. Dr. Marcus Osai, the historian, was checking his files on a small screen. Una Park, the communications officer, was testing her earpiece. The others were putting on their formal clothes and reviewing the documents they had read many times already. They all knew what today's meeting was about. The assembly was going to vote on something called the Quarantine Doctrine. Elena had read the full text of the doctrine 3 times. In simple words, it meant this: if a civilization was dying from a disease and that civilization had not yet reached the stars, then no one was allowed to help them. No medicine, no contact, no rescue. You were supposed to watch from a distance and record what happened and call it a natural event. The planet in question was called Karath IV. The people who lived there were called the Velhari. Elena had read about them too. They had language. They had music. They built things with their hands and grew food and cared for their children. They did not have spaceships. They did not know that other beings existed in the stars above them. And right now, a plague was moving through their cities and killing them in large numbers. There was a cure. Not a cure that the Velhari had made, but one that existed somewhere in the medical records of the galaxy's elder races. It had not been offered. Under the Quarantine Doctrine, it would not be offered. Elena pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window. She thought about this for a moment, and then she turned away. The Resolute docked at Conclave Prime in the early hours of the morning cycle. Conclave Prime was the Assembly's main station, and it was so large that it seemed less like a station and more like a small world. It had its own atmosphere inside, its own weather systems, its own districts and markets and quiet places where you could sit and think. The human delegation had been here twice before, always as observers, always careful and quiet, always on their best behavior. Today they walked through the long white corridors toward the main chamber, and Elena noticed things she always noticed. The height of the Thavians, who were tall and silver-skinned and moved like water. The low humming that came from the Gret Combine delegates, whose bodies vibrated slightly when they breathed. The strange smell of the 7 crowns of Oru, something like old paper and rain. These were the elder races. They had been building civilizations when humans were still living in caves on a small blue planet that nobody cared about. Elena respected them. She had spent her whole career trying to understand them and work with them and find common ground. But as she walked toward the chamber today, she felt something hard and cold sitting in her chest that she could not quite push away. The main chamber of the Galactic Assembly was the most impressive room Elena had ever been in. It was circular, and it rose up in tiers like a great bowl, with seats arranged in curved rows all the way from the floor to the very top. The ceiling was transparent, and beyond it you could see the stars. In the center, at the bottom of the bowl, was the speaker's floor, where whoever held the floor could stand and address all 412 delegations at once. The human delegation had seats near the back, in the upper tiers. Provisional members always sat in the upper tiers. It was not stated anywhere in the rules that this was because they were considered less important. It did not need to be stated. Alina sat down and arranged her papers and looked around at the room filling up. The session was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. All around her, delegates from dozens of worlds settled into their seats and spoke quietly to each other or read from their own documents or simply waited. None of them looked worried. Most of them looked like they had done this many times before and expected to be done again in a few hours and go to dinner. Speaker Auron took the floor. He was a Thavian, tall and composed, with a voice that carried through the entire chamber without effort. He welcomed the delegations. He went through the order of business. He arrived in due time at the matter of the quarantine doctrine and the Kareth IV situation. The presentation was given by a Gret Combine scientist. The facts were laid out clearly: the plague, the projected death toll, the timeline, the existence of a viable treatment noted in passing as a point of scientific interest, not as a point of moral urgency. The recommendation was unanimous among the presenting committee. The quarantine doctrine applied. No intervention was to be authorized. The vote would proceed. Alina raised her hand to request the floor. The request was noted by an aide who came to her row. The aide was polite and efficient. Alina's request was taken down, processed, and returned to her in under 2 minutes with a small notation on the bottom. Provisional members did not hold speaking rights on doctrine matters. She could submit a written statement, which would be filed and reviewed at a later date. Alina put the paper down on her knee and looked at it for a moment. Marcus, sitting beside her, said nothing. He had seen her face before when it looked like this. He had learned not to say anything when it looked like this. The debate continued on the floor below. Delegates from ancient civilizations spoke about the importance of non-interference. They spoke about the long view of galactic history, about how the natural development of species should not be disturbed, about how the Velhari had their own path to walk, and it was not for others to alter it. They spoke calmly and with great authority, the way people speak when they are very sure of themselves and have been very sure of themselves for a very long time. Alina listened to all of it. She listened carefully, the way she always did. She did not let her face show anything. But in her chest, the hard, cold thing was still there, and it was getting heavier. The recess was called 40 minutes into the session, as it always was. Delegates filed out of the main chamber through their various exits, heading to private rooms or common areas or the long observation balconies where you could stand and look out at the stars and feel very small or very important, depending on who you were. Alina took her team to the room that had been assigned to the human delegation. It was a plain room, smaller than most, with a long table and chairs and a screen on the wall. They had used it before. It was not comfortable, but it was private. She sat down and put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Marcus opened his files. He had brought something with him. He had been carrying it since before they left Earth, and he had not shown it to anyone yet. Now he pulled it up on the screen without saying a word and turned the screen so they could all see. It was a list. The list was a record of every major plague and epidemic in human history, going back as far as the records went. The numbers were very large. Marcus read them aloud in a quiet voice. He did not try to make the numbers sound more or less terrible than they were. He just read them. The Black Death in the 14th century, somewhere between 75 million and 200 million dead. The smallpox that followed the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, tens of millions who had no immunity and no knowledge and no warning. The flu pandemic at the start of the 20th century, over 50 million in 2 years. He kept reading, the others listened. Alina did not look at the screen. She was looking at the table. She was thinking about the Velhari. When Marcus finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Unipark cleared her throat and said that she had been trying to file a formal objection through the assembly's back channels before the session started. She had found the correct form. She had submitted it properly. It had been returned to her with a code stamped on it that meant it had been rejected for procedural reasons. She had tried a second form, a different kind. Rejected again. She had found a third form, a very old one, meant for emergency humanitarian requests. She had filled it out and submitted it. It was still processing, which in assembly language usually meant it would be processed after the vote was already over. Alina nodded. She had expected this. She said thank you to Yuna and was quiet for a moment longer. One of the other delegates, a young man named Sira Cho who had only been on the team for 8 months, asked what the plan was. He asked it carefully, the way junior people ask questions when they are not sure they should be asking. Alina did not answer right away. She stood up and said she was going to walk for a while, and she left the room. Conclave Prime had many public areas. There were markets where traders from dozens of worlds sold things Alina had no names for. There were restaurants where the smells were strange and sometimes overwhelming. There were gardens where plants from different planets grew under carefully controlled lights. And there was, on the 3rd level near the main atrium, a cultural exhibition hall. Alina had walked past it before but never gone in. Now she went in. The hall was long and low and lit in a soft way that made everything look a little like a museum at closing time. There were exhibits from many different worlds, artifacts under glass, recordings playing on small screens, information presented in the assembly's common language which Alina read slowly. Most of the exhibits were interesting in an abstract way, the way that ancient things in a museum are interesting. She stopped at one exhibit near the far end of the hall. The placard above it said, in plain letters, Velhari Cultural Preservation Sample, collected prior to projected extinction event. Alina stood in front of the glass case and looked at what was inside. There was a small pot, hand-shaped from reddish clay. There was a piece of cloth with a pattern woven into it in brown and gold thread. There was a flat piece of stone with marks carved into it that looked like writing or numbers or something between the two. There was a small recording device, the kind the assembly used to document species, and above it a screen played a loop of sound. It was music, low and simple and made with instruments Alina did not know, a voice singing something she could not understand. She stood there and listened. She did not know how long she stood there. Long enough that a Thavian couple moving through the hall looked at her with mild curiosity and then moved on. Long enough that the loop cycled through twice. A species with music. A species that made pots and wove cloth and carved things into stone. A species that sang. And somewhere out there right now, that species was dying, and the greatest collection of civilizations in the galaxy had decided that the correct response was to collect a few samples and press record. She went back to the delegation room. Her team looked up when she came in. She told them she had one more thing she needed to try. She said she wanted to reach the Secretary General directly and explain the situation fully and ask for permission to take more aggressive action through diplomatic channels. It was a long shot. She knew it was a long shot, but she wanted to try. She sent the message. It was a careful message, detailed and respectful. She laid out the facts plainly. She described the Velhari, the plague, the available cure that was not being offered. She described the vote that was coming. She asked what the Secretary General wanted the delegation to do. The response came back in less than 30 minutes, which was actually faster than she expected. It was also more careful than she had hoped. The Secretary General wrote that he appreciated Alina's thorough communication. He wrote that he understood her concerns. He wrote that humanity's trade agreements with 3 of the Assembly's major races were still in the early stages, and that any disruption to standing at this time could have significant effects on Earth's economic relationships over the next decade. He wrote that he trusted Alina to handle the situation with the wisdom she had always shown. He wrote that he was sure she understood the importance of maintaining good relations with the elder races. He did not say do nothing. He did not need to. Alina read the message once, then she read it again. Then she set it down on the table beside her and looked at the wall. Marcus was watching her. He said nothing. After a while, she picked the message up and folded it carefully and put it in the inner pocket of her jacket, close to her chest, where she would feel it there. She was not sure why she did that. Maybe so she would not forget what it felt like to read it. Maybe so she would carry the weight of it herself rather than put it down somewhere and leave it. The recess was almost over. Delegates were beginning to move back toward the chamber. Alina stood up and straightened her jacket and told her team it was time to go back in. They followed her out into the corridor without a word. All of them had seen her face. All of them had made their own quiet decisions, standing in that small plain room, about what kind of people they wanted to be. The chamber filled again slowly. Delegates settled into their seats with the comfortable ease of people who had done this many times. There was quiet conversation, the rustling of papers, the low sound of the ventilation system that was always running somewhere in the walls of Conclave Prime. It was an ordinary afternoon on the station. For most of the people in this room, it would remain that way. Alina took her seat in the upper tier. Her team sat around her. She did not look at any of them and they did not look at her. They all looked forward, toward the speaker's floor at the bottom of the chamber bowl, where Speaker Auron was arranging his notes and preparing to call the session back to order. The vote on the quarantine doctrine was the only item left on the afternoon's agenda. It was expected to be brief. The debate had already been had, the positions already stated. All that remained was the formal recording of each delegation's vote, beginning with the elder races in the lower tiers and working upward through the chamber in order of standing and seniority. The human delegation would be called near the end. Provisional members always were. Speaker Auron called the session to order. He recapped the matter before the assembly in a few clear sentences. He asked if there were any final points of order before the vote began. There were none. He opened the roll call. The Thavian delegation voted in favor of the doctrine. Their vote was stated cleanly and without comment, because the Thavians had helped write the doctrine 300 years ago and had never wavered in their support of it. The Gret Combine voted in favor. Their senior delegate gave a short statement about the integrity of natural development and the long history of the doctrine's success in preserving the uncontaminated growth of emerging species. The 7 crowns of Oru voted in favor. So did the Pelhari Compact. So did the Murin sovereignty, whose civilization was so old that nobody in the chamber was completely sure how old it actually was. Delegation by delegation, the vote accumulated. In favor, in favor, in favor. There were no votes against. There were 2 abstentions from smaller member races, but they were noted and passed over quickly, and the roll call continued. Alina sat very still. She was watching and listening and counting in her head. When the human delegation was called, she stood. She did not stand to give a vote. She stood the way you stand when you have something to say, which was different, and apparently the aide who had been watching the delegations could tell the difference, because he came up the tier toward her with a polite but firm expression. Alina waited until he reached her. He reminded her, very quietly, of what she had already been told. Provisional members did not hold speaking rights on doctrine matters. She could submit a written statement. She thanked him. She remained standing. He repeated the rule. She nodded to show she had heard it. She remained standing. He went back down the tier. Speaker Auron looked up toward the human section. He paused the roll call. He said in his clear carrying voice that the chair recognized the human delegation and reminded all provisional members of the rules governing speaking rights in doctrine votes. He said this in the calm tone of a man who was genuinely not worried, because in 4 centuries of chairing sessions, no provisional member had ever done anything other than sit back down. Alina looked at him from the upper tier, then she spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was not shaking. It was very ordinary, the kind of voice you might use to describe something you had seen on the street, something that had struck you as strange and worth mentioning. She said that her name was Alina Vasquez, and she was the ambassador of Earth, and she had something to say before the vote was recorded. Speaker Oren said that she did not have the right to say it. He said this politely but clearly. Alina said she understood that, and then she kept talking. She said the Velhari were not an event. She said they were not a sample in a glass case. She said they made music and pots and cloth, and they had a word for grief. She was sure of it. Every people who ever lived long enough to lose someone had a word for grief, and the assembly was about to let millions of them die of a disease that could be cured. Her microphone was cut. The feed that broadcast her voice to the translation systems in every delegate's earpiece went silent. She kept talking. Her voice was quieter without the amplification, but it was still there, still clear to the people nearest her and audible, if only barely, to the rows below. She said that Earth had its own history with plagues. She said that humans knew what it meant to watch and do nothing. They had done it. They had written it down and read it to their children so they would not do it again. She said she was not willing to carry that history across the stars and plant it somewhere new. Then she stopped. The chamber was very quiet. She looked around at it for a moment, this enormous room full of ancient civilizations and 400 years of doctrine and all the serious, important business of the galaxy. Then she reached down and picked up her papers and her bag. She looked at her team. She did not say anything. She did not need to. All 11 of them stood up. They moved along the row, past other delegates who were watching with confusion or alarm or a careful expression that had no clear name. They filed down the tier steps slowly and in order, not rushing, not pushing. Alina walked at the front. She did not look back at the speaker's floor or at Speaker Oren or at the hundreds of delegations watching from every level of the chamber. Behind her, she could hear the chamber beginning to react. The procedural calls started first. Then Speaker Oren's voice, louder now, stating that the delegation was in violation of assembly procedure. Then a low sound from the chamber itself, a murmur that moved through the tiers like a wave moving through water. Alina reached the main exit of the human section. The doors were large and opened automatically when you approached them. They had opened and closed for delegates hundreds of times every day, and there was nothing special about them. She walked through them. Her team followed her. The doors closed behind them. In the corridor outside, the noise of the chamber was muffled but still audible through the walls. Alina stopped walking. She stood still for a moment in the corridor with its white walls and soft lighting. She pressed one hand flat against the wall beside her, not leaning on it, just touching it. Her eyes were closed. Then she opened them, straightened her jacket, and looked at her team. They were all watching her. Some of them looked scared. Some of them looked the way people look when they have done something they know they cannot undo and have decided that is all right. She said, "We need to move quickly. There is not much time." They followed her down the corridor. Behind them, in the chamber, the vote continued without the human delegation's voice. But something had changed in the room, something that did not have a name yet, something that had happened when 11 people stood up together and walked away from a bad decision rather than sit quietly and let it be made. The galaxy had seen many things. It had not quite seen this before. News moved fast in the galaxy. Not as fast as light, but faster than almost anything else. Within 2 hours of the walkout, the story was on every major information network that served assembly member worlds. Within 4 hours, it had reached places that did not normally follow assembly proceedings, the smaller worlds, the outer colonies, the ships and stations that sat far from the centers of power and usually received their news days or weeks late. The story went like this. A human ambassador had refused to be silent. She had spoken without permission in a chamber where provisional members were not permitted to speak. Her entire team had walked out. The assembly had continued the vote without them and ratified the quarantine doctrine by a margin that was nearly unanimous. Everything had happened exactly as planned, except for the part that had not been planned. On Conclave Prime, in the private communication rooms used by delegations, the reactions came quickly. The Thavian diplomatic office sent a formal message to the human delegation within the hour. It was polite and precise and very cold. It described the walkout as a serious breach of assembly procedure and protocol. It noted that provisional membership carried specific obligations and that the human delegation had failed to meet them. It said that a formal censure process would be initiated and that Earth's standing in the assembly should be considered uncertain until the process was complete. The Gret Combine sent a shorter message that said much the same thing in fewer words. Two other messages came that were different. One was from a small delegation that Alina did not recognize immediately, a people called the Rinthari, whose world was in a distant arm of the galaxy and who had very little political weight in the assembly. The message was just 3 sentences. It said that the Rinthari people had watched what happened. It said they had lost a great many of their own people to a plague 600 years ago, before they reached the stars. It said they were sorry they had not voted differently today. The second message was not from a delegation at all. It was from a junior diplomat named Asel Merv, who worked for the Sulhari Collective. Alina had never spoken to her. The message asked for a private meeting as soon as possible in one of the station's smaller common rooms. Alina sent a reply saying she would be there in an hour. But before the meeting, there was the other thing, the thing that changed the shape of the story. Marcus found it. He had been monitoring the Assembly's public information channels, the way he always did, looking for anything that might be useful or significant. And there it was, filed in the Assembly's Medical Research Archive, available to anyone with the right access credentials, which apparently included the person who had pulled it out and made it visible to the General Assembly network. It was a research document, dated 11 years ago. The title was dry and scientific, but the content was clear. A full treatment protocol for the plague currently affecting Kareth IV. Complete. Tested. Filed under a category that translated roughly as low-priority species, insufficient strategic value. The cure had been there for 11 years. It had been sitting in a database while the Velhari died. Marcus called Alina into the corridor outside their delegation room and showed her on his screen. She read it without saying anything. Her face did not change very much. She handed the screen back to him. She said, "Make sure everyone sees this. Send it to every public channel you have access to. Make sure the record is clear." Then she went to meet Asel Merv. The common room was one of the small ones, plain and quiet, with a table and a few chairs and a window that looked out at the station's internal garden. Asel was already there when Alina arrived. She was young, younger than Alina had expected, with a careful, serious expression. She stood up when Alina came in and they sat down across from each other. Asel said that she had not come with official permission from the Sulhari Collective. She wanted Alina to know that first. She was here on her own. Alina said she understood. Asel said that the Sulhari Collective had lost close to half its population 5 centuries ago to a disease that had spread through their world in less than 2 years. She said it was not something the collective discussed publicly. It was considered a private matter, a dark time in their history that had mostly been put away. But she had grown up knowing about it. Her grandmother had told her the numbers the way you tell children important things, very simply, so the weight of them settles in properly. She said that today, when the vote was taken, the Sulhari Collective had voted in favor of the doctrine. She had been in the room. She had watched the vote recorded. She had said nothing. Then she had watched the human delegation stand up and walk out. She looked at Alina across the table and said that she wanted to know what happened next. She wanted to know if there was something that could still be done for the Velhari, and if there was, she wanted to help. Alina looked at her for a moment. Then she took a small notepad from her jacket pocket and wrote a name on it and slid it across the table. It was the name of a human medical research station, one of 3 that had already responded to Alina's call for volunteers. She said that the Resolute was being provisioned right now. She said it was leaving in the morning cycle, and it was going to Kareth IV, and it was taking as much medical equipment and supplies as it could carry. She said this was not authorized by the Assembly. She said Earth's government had not approved it either. She said anyone who came would be doing so in violation of Assembly doctrine and possibly in breach of their own diplomatic standing. Assel picked up the notepad and looked at the name on it. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket. She said she would make some calls. Alina went back to the Resolute and found her team already at work. Yuna was on communications. Sierra was helping load supplies that had arrived from the human colony freighter that had docked an hour ago. Marcus was organizing the medical protocols and making sure they had everything they needed for the approach to Kareth IV. The ship was not large enough. Alina knew that already. The supplies were not enough. The people were not enough. But they were what there was, and they were going anyway, and sometimes that was the only answer available. She stood on the deck and watched her team work and felt the weight of the Secretary General's letter still in her jacket pocket. She had not taken it out again. She thought she might carry it the whole way to Kareth IV and back, so she would remember exactly how it had felt to read it and exactly what she had decided afterward. Outside the station, the stars were the same as always, distant and cold and completely indifferent. But the Resolute was ready, and it was pointed in the right direction, and that was enough to start. Kareth IV from orbit looked like a lot of worlds looked from orbit, blue and brown and green and wrapped in thin white cloud. It was a small planet and a quiet one, as far as the instruments could tell. The Resolute held its position above the northern continent where the largest population centers were, and where the plague was worst. Alina stood on the bridge and looked at the planet and thought about the fact that the people down there did not know she was there. They did not know about the Galactic Assembly or the quarantine doctrine or the vote that had been taken on their behalf without their knowledge or their consent. They knew there was a sickness moving through their cities and taking people before their time. That was the thing they knew. The medical team went down first. 3 people from the Resolute and 4 from the colony freighter that had caught up with them 2 days out from Conclave Prime. They went in a small shuttle, and they landed in a field outside the largest city, and they walked in carrying what they had. The Velhari were not a small people. They were tall and pale-skinned with large, dark eyes, and they moved in careful ways, like people who had learned to be gentle with things. When the shuttle came down, they gathered at a distance and watched it, because they had never seen anything like it. Alina watched the landing on a screen. She saw the moment when the lead medic, a woman named Dr. Hana Solis, walked toward the gathered Velhari with her hands open at her sides in the oldest signal there was. She watched the Velhari watch Hana come and not run. She watched one of them step forward. She turned away from the screen and went to check on the supply situation. 2 more ships arrived the next day. One was from a human research station in the outer system, still loading supplies when it had left, its crew working with whatever they had. The other was not human. It was a Sulhari vessel, smaller than the Resolute, carrying 4 Sulhari medical specialists who had apparently taken personal leave on very short notice. Assel Merv was not on the ship. She had sent it. There was a brief message with it that said only, "My grandmother would have done the same." Over the next week, more ships came. Not many, not a fleet, but they came one at a time, from different worlds, from different peoples, and the thing they had in common was that none of them had been authorized to come, and all of them had come anyway. A Rinthari cargo ship that had converted its hold into a medical bay. A vessel from a people Alina had never even heard of, whose name in the common language translated to something like the Steady Ones, and whose crew worked without rest and asked for nothing. The cure was not a perfect thing. It was not a switch that you flipped and the disease was gone. It was a process, slow and careful, and it took time and it did not save everyone. There were Velhari who were too far gone when the treatment reached them. There were whole families in the outer districts of the city who were found too late. The medics worked through the nights and the days and the nights again, and they were tired in the way that people get tired when the work is very heavy and very necessary. But the dying slowed. And then it slowed more. And then, in the city's central district, a medic looked at her numbers for the first time in 9 days and said out loud that she thought they might be winning. Back on Conclave Prime, the assembly held its emergency session. The chamber was different than it had been during the vote. There was more noise in it, more argument. The leaked archive document had done what leaked documents do, which is make it very hard for anyone to pretend they did not know a thing they clearly knew. Several delegations that had voted in favor of the doctrine had already put out statements saying that they had been unaware of the archived cure, which may or may not have been true. But the statements themselves were significant because no delegation had ever felt the need to issue one before. Speaker Oran ran the session with his usual precision, but the session was harder to run than usual. The formal censure motion against the human delegation was put forward and debated. It passed, narrowly, with a number of abstentions that would not have been abstentions 3 weeks ago. Humanity's provisional membership was suspended pending a review that was expected to take a long time. Alina received the notice of suspension in a message while she was sitting in the medical bay on Kareth IV, helping to catalog supplies. She read it and put her screen away and went back to work. She sent her final statement to the assembly that evening. It was not long. She had spent a long time thinking about what to say and had eventually decided that less was more. She wrote that humanity had reviewed the assembly's records and reviewed their own records and made a choice accordingly. She wrote that when the assembly was ready to discuss what silence costs, humanity would be at the table. She did not write anything more than that. She thought the rest could be left to time. The morning the Resolute prepared to leave, Alina went down to the city one more time. She walked through the streets for about an hour, past the houses and the market stalls and the places where children played in the roads, the same children who had been sick 3 weeks ago and were now outside in the air. The Velhari she passed looked at her with the expression people have when they do not know the right words but want to say something anyway. She came back to the shuttle at the edge of the field and found one of her medics, a young man named Ro Takeda, standing by the door with a small camera in his hand. He was looking through the lens at something near the shuttle's side. Alina followed his gaze and saw her. A small Velhari girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing close to the shuttle. She had large dark eyes and short pale hair, and she was looking at the curved metal surface of the shuttle hull the way children look at things that are new and strange and wonderful. Then she lifted one hand and pressed it flat against the hull, palm open, fingers spread. Ro lowered his camera slowly. He stepped forward and pressed his own palm against the hull from the other side, where she could see the shape of it. They held that pose for a moment, the child and the medic, separated by a thin wall of metal, hands pressed flat in parallel. Alina watched. She did not say anything. Ro's camera was still recording. She thought about the elder races and their long records and their ancient certainties, and the doctrine they had built over centuries to keep themselves at a comfortable distance from the small and vulnerable things. She thought about the girl's hand on the hull. The galaxy had been watching since the walkout. Some of it had been outraged. Some of it had been unsettled in ways it had not yet found words for. Some of it, slowly and quietly and without making announcements, had begun to remember something it had known a long time ago and set aside because setting things aside is easy when you have been powerful long enough. The Resolute lifted off at midday. Alina stood at the forward window and watched Kareth IV grow smaller. She stayed there until it was just another small light among the many, and then she turned away and went to find her team. There was a lot of work still to do. There always was. But they were pointed in the right direction, and they were going to keep going, and sometimes that was the whole of it.